watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I'm talking about watches. Today I am going to be comparing my brother's Omega Seamaster GMT with the homage to that watch, the Phylida GMT. A big thank you to my brother for allowing me to borrow his Omega. Now, when we are comparing these watches, obviously there is going to be big differences between them. The Omega, when it was purchased new, was 5,000 Australian dollars, and even though it is now almost 10 years old, it still holds that about 5,000 Australian dollars on the used market. Whereas the Phylida, it cost 130 Australian dollars brand new. So we're not really going to be saying these watches are the same, but obviously the Phylida is homaging the Omega. So today what I want to show you is how well it homages the Omega and whether it is also justified and worthwhile buying. I know at 130 Australian dollars, that's not a huge amount of money. It is interesting, however, to be able to put it side by side with the watch that it is homaging. So before we jump into it, if you haven't clicked on that little subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it if you just go click. It really helps to motivate me to keep making these videos. So let's jump into this video and let's see how this Phylida and how well the Phylida does when it is homaging the Omega.
So here's a video that I've been looking forward to doing for some time. I bought this Phylida GMT homage watch mostly because I did like the look of it. I obviously love my brother's Omega here. However, I really did want to do this comparison video. It's something that I have been quite interested to do. And now that my brother was nice enough to lend me his Omega for a couple of days, I can get a bit better feel for it and have a bit of an understanding of what the differences and similarities between these watches are. So let's just take into account though, we're looking at a 5,000 Australian dollar watch here, and we're looking at a watch that's just over 100 Australian dollars. Now I am going to be comparing them from the perspective of a watch enthusiast, a watch wearer, a customer of these watch brands. How does it feel on wrist? How does it look? You know, the technology inside is obviously very, very different. I'm not a watchmaker, so I can't really comment on how much better the movement is inside here. I know it is significantly better. So I'm just going to be talking about what I observe, what I feel, and what I see in front of me. One of the things I am going to be talking about a lot is how well this one has homaged the original Omega, okay? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the dimensions. The Omega has a case diameter of 41.3. The Phylida is 41 right on the nose. The thickness of it is 14.4 millimeters. We are looking at 14.2 millimeters. So the Phylida is actually a little bit thinner than the Omega. We're talking about a lug-to-lug of 47 millimeters on the Omega with an effective lug-to-lug with those male end links of 52.3 millimeters. The Phylida has a lug-to-lug of 46.6 millimeters with an effective lug-to-lug of 47.9. So it is a little bit smaller on wrist, only by a little bit, but just a little bit. Both have the same 20 millimeter lug width. And one thing that we do notice quite significantly about the two watches when we're holding them in the hands is the Omega is weighty. It is a lot heavier, has that really nice sort of solid feel. That's because it is 170 grams versus the 159 grams of the Phylida. And I've divided this up into sections. So firstly, let's talk about the dial. Let's talk about what's the differences. And there is quite a significant difference. And then this is going to become a bit of a theme in this comparison. We're talking about the details. We're talking about the sizing of things. Let's look at the detail of the dial. It has that wave pattern throughout it. It is very subtle. It is very well executed. It is very soft. It sort of doesn't stand out too much to you. But now let's look at the Phylida. It is certainly still there. We've got that wave pattern throughout the dial, but it is much more significant. It is sort of much thicker. It feels bulkier, more of a 3D effect, and it feels a lot more plasticky. You know, it's sort of, you can see it's a molded plastic versus something that has been really sort of, a lot of attention has been put into it. Printing, well, the printing on the Omega, on the dial there, is a lot smaller. It's a lot more delicate. The printing on the Phylida is actually done very well, but as you can see, it's bigger, it's chunkier, it's not quite as fine detailed. And that is going to be a trend when we're talking throughout the rest of this video. This is a little bit more chunky, a little bit less detail. This is much more fine, much more well thought out, a little bit more crisper. And that's sort of what you expect when you are spending a lot more money on a watch. Let's talk about the hands. Obviously, they both look very, very similar in the design and the style of it. But again, the Omega is much finer, much more elegant, where there's a little bit more chunk done to the Phylida. You can see that it's not cut out quite as well, those hands. There's a lot of difference in the finer details of the two. The crystals, they both have sapphire crystal, both double domed, both have a very, very, very minor doming to them, both very good. I'm going to assume the Omega is a better piece of sapphire crystal just because of the price range, but when you're actually feeling it, when you're actually looking at it, they certainly both appear the same. AR coating, well, let's have a look in the direct light. Well, I know the Omega has some good AR coating on it, but the PYHLIDA is just as easy to read. There's not really much of a difference there. I'm not sure how much AR coating, if any, that the PYHLIDA has. Let's check out the lume between these two watches, because this is going to be a difference as well. As we can see, and I think, again, the lume on the Omega is finer done. It is very crisp. The lines of it, the delicacy of it is very nice. The lume on the PYHLIDA is actually quite good, but as you can see, it just doesn't look quite as good. It just doesn't come together as a whole. The movements inside these watches, as I said, is a massive significant difference between this. Inside here we have the Omega caliber 2628 with a 48-hour power reserve with a coaxial escapement movement. Very, very nice, very, very pretty. On the back of here we have a see-through case back, so we can actually sort of see that movement, and it's all very prettied up. It's just a lovely movement to look at. So this is a very good movement, and at this sort of price you expect a very good movement. The PYHLIDA, however, it certainly is noticeably how much cheaper and how much sort of basic the movement is inside this, even through just your daily wearing and changing and moving around those hands. So inside here we have the Chinese movement, the DG5833. It's slightly more unknown than the Omega. It doesn't have quite as many information on the internet. But we can sort of we know for a fact that the Omega is significantly, vastly different in between these two watches. However, talking about the movement, let's talk about the functionality of that GMT movement, because this is actually quite an interesting thing to compare the two. This is what you're actually going to be noticing when you're sort of wearing the watch and the functionality. Both have this GMT hand. Both of them are only a 24-hour GMT hand. It doesn't show a second time zone. What it does is show a 24-hour time zone. So we can set it so that it effectively gives us a second time zone. Exactly the same on the Omega. It is a 24-hour hand. It can show and display a second time zone in the 24-hour. Now, how we use and how we action that 24-hour hand is a little bit different. On the Omega, we can adjust that hour hand independently. So we can move it back and forth. But then the 24-hour hand is slaved to that hour hand. So then when we go to change that, we need to change the entire movement. Obviously, the big positive of the Omega there is if you change time zone, you can just flick that hour hand slightly and maintain the 24-hour hand in the same time zone that you initially set it to. The PYHLIDA, however, is very different. You cannot independently move that hour hand. However, you can independently move the 24-hour hand. So you independently set the 24-hour hand to wherever you like compared to the initial hour hand, and then you action the whole movement if you want to then move everything together. And let's talk bezels and bezel action, because there's actually a bit of similarities and some big differences. The PYHLIDA has sort of almost like a ceramic insert here, so it's a lot more shiny versus the aluminium insert. The colors are a little bit different. They sort of slope similar, but there's a little bit more chunk to the PYHLIDA there. You can see it's a little bit thicker on the edge here. It doesn't slope quite as much. Bezel action, however, sort of similar in a way. Obviously, the Omega is a little bit better. Both a little bit hard to grab hold onto though. A little bit firmer, a little bit clickier, but still very good. They both have a helium escape valve. Well, the only difference is this is actually a helium escape valve. And as you would expect on the PYHLIDA, that's not a real helium escape valve. You can unscrew it and screw it up again, but I'm certainly not going to say that it actually does what the Omega has intended for that screw down valve to do. Looking at the case backs, well, there's a pretty significant difference there, isn't it? The Omega has a see-through case back showing off that stunning, beautiful Omega movement. And we have a fairly simple case back on the PYHLIDA. It is very neat and tidy, the PYHLIDA. I think it's done actually quite well. And I think they've actually made a good decision there. I don't think if they put a see-through case back on the PYHLIDA, it certainly wouldn't look the same, because the movement doesn't look anywhere near as good. So now we come to the lugs and the bracelet and the clasp, which is actually probably one of the things that I was most interested in about these two, because the clasp and the lugs and the bracelet on the Omega is particularly stunning. What I do want to say is it is a solid end links on the Omega. There is a little bit of wiggle, but this watch is almost 10 years old. It is worn very regularly throughout that 10 years, so I do expect it to be a little bit not perfect, I guess. It does transition very well. It's super, super comfortable, super, super silky. But what does surprise me is that's actually just one solid lug. There's no individual pieces there. If it is individual pieces, it certainly doesn't feel like it. You can feel it is one sort of piece of steel that has been made to look like individual pieces of steel. If you know better than that, leave me a comment to say that it's not, but even if it is individual, it doesn't wear like individual. That is one solid piece of steel there. The differences between that and the Phylida is a little bit different here. So we have solid end links, which fit very, very well actually. I don't feel it transitions quite as well onto the bracelet, and that's mostly because the way that the bracelet has been sort of refined at the end of the process. It is not quite as neat and tidy. It does get a little bit stuck on those movements, as you can see. Yep, so the edges aren't refined. It's fairly simply done. It does, however, look a lot like the Omega, but if we look really closely, you can see that it's copying this sort of pattern, but it certainly isn't refined as well. In between those links of the Omega, on the edges of the links of the Omega, it's curved down, it's curved over the edges, where this is a little bit more straight, a little bit more square. It doesn't have that refinement, and therefore it doesn't have that nice silky feel to it on wrist. I think from a look perspective, it doesn't do too badly, but it's probably one of the more sort of biggest differences between this watch, just visually. Now the clasps. Now let's have a look at the clasps. Obviously the Omega, with Omega written on the left, the Phylida on the right. I think the Phylida is done actually pretty well here, but there is some significant differences. One of my favorite parts of the Omega is how the bracelet transitions into the clasp. It transitions so smoothly. There's no sort of edge there as you run your finger over. Whereas the Phylida, you hit that clasp and you're up and onto it, and then you drop back down again. And that's done because there is this nice transition from the clasp there into that first lug of the bracelet there. Transitions beautifully. Whereas this is more of a traditional sort of, just you add the end lug underneath the clasp. They both have a double pusher, and what's quite interesting, what's quite impressive of the Phylida here is the inside milled sections of the clasp there are very similar. And what's even more surprising is the rest of the clasp construction. We have the Omega on the left and the Phylida on the right. They are both completely milled, both nice and chunky, plenty of steel in there, plenty of nice, thick, solid feel there. But you can see that there's a nice curve to the Omega. It's a little bit more delicate, a little bit better, well proportioned, whereas it's a little bit more flatter on the Phylida. It's not quite as delicate. And another particular interest point about these watches, we have the Omega on the left and the Phylida on the right. Now please excuse the dirt on this. My brother wears this watch a lot, and I didn't think that was really good for me to completely polish it and clean it for him. I didn't want there to be any opportunity to damage this watch. But you can see they're both fully milled. The Omega is certainly made a little bit better, a little bit finer. It certainly incorporates how it incorporates into the clasp a little bit better, a little bit firmer. But they both have a really nice, solid feeling. Solid, it really does feel very strong, milled diver's extension. So what do they feel like on wrist? Well, they actually both feel very good. But when you do compare the two, when you're having them on one wrist, like on each, like I'm doing right here, you certainly do feel that this is slightly heavier than the Omega. It feels a little bit more seated on top of your wrist. The bracelet certainly feels like it's tucked around and more silky. The base of the clasp there certainly feels nicer with that transition. Feels like it's hugged down to the wrist. Whereas the Phylida sort of does feel a little bit more bobbly on top of the wrist. There's a little bit more weight up here in the head of the watch. It doesn't transition quite as well into the bracelet. The bracelet does feel nice, it does feel comfortable, but there's just a big significant difference with the feel on your wrist. Then the clasp, as you can see, it sort of sits on top a little bit, saying that it is still quite nice and smooth, and it does fit nice underneath the wrist. It is actually quite amazing that the Phylida does fit so well to wrist, you know, considering the difference in the price point. So I'll try and show you what they sort of look like on wrist, on my 6 3/4 inch wrists at the same time, just to give you a bit of an understanding of how it looks and how it feels. Certainly both fit very nicely onto the wrist. But yeah, as I was saying, the Omega is just a little bit more delicate. It sort of curves and fits a little bit better to wrist. So when we're looking down the wrist, you can see they both fit and feel quite nice, but there is a little bit of a difference, as you would kind of expect. So let's flip back to me now, and let me give you some of my final thoughts about the comparison between these two. They are very different watches, very different price points, but obviously homaging one on the other, it's kind of an interesting thing and an interesting comparison to have. And let me talk to you about how I feel about how well the Phylida does when it is homaging the Omega. Let's flip back to me for those final thoughts.
So I hope that this comparison really does identify how good the Phylida does at this sort of $130 Australian price point. Because really, if we take the movement out of it, if we sort of pretend the movements don't exist, because there is a vast differences in the movements in these two watches, but let's put that aside, I think the Phylida actually does very, very well at sort of homaging and sort of giving you a really sort of similar wrist feel to the Omega. Obviously, it's not quite as refined. The bracelet isn't quite as refined. The clasp isn't quite as sort of integrated into that bracelet. It is absolutely amazing how well it has done that and how good quality it is and how nice it actually is. Yes, the movements are vastly different. The Omega, I can't even tell you how many times better the Omega's movement is to the Phylida's. It's just that much different. But if you only want to spend a small, affordable amount of money, but you love this Omega or this style of Omega, well then I think the Phylida is absolutely a great choice to look at. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I really do appreciate it. I hope to see you in the next video.